Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to share my research. And I just want to make this as informal as possible, so please interrupt me at any point. Network analysis can seem like a pretty intuitive concept, but when you get down to some of the equations and statistics, it gets a little more complicated. So please stop me at any point. I'm also looking for a lot of feedback. I would like to consider publishing a paper I'm working on relevant to this, so any feedback you have on the methodology or any part of my presentation, please let me know. So with that, I wanted to start with an image that really inspired me to do this research in the first place. On the top left, we have a network map of the US House of Representatives in 1969. And on the bottom right, we have a network of the US House of Representatives in 2011. And intuitively, it's pretty clear that between 1969 and 2011, US Congress has become increasingly polarized. Each of those individual nodes, as we call them, are representative of individual US Congress people. And the ties between them, which you might not be able to see very clearly in these images, but the ties between them represent an above average likeness of voting behavior. So if two individuals voted with one another more than the kind of threshold average number of times, there was a tie between them. And noteworthy in this, if you look at the bottom right image, is the fact that if you are a congressperson in the Democratic Party and you wanted to reach a member of the Republican Party on a particular issue, you would not have a lot of means to get to them if you look at the connections just in this map. There's really only a few particular individuals that vote with Republicans on a number of issues. And so if you wanted to build a coalition, if you wanted to collaborate with one another, you would have to go through those specific few nodes in the network. And that is the concept of brokerage. Brokerage being defined as the ability to arrange or negotiate a sort of deal or a plan in order to get something done. And so that is the concept that I wanted to look at in the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference. It's no secret that there has been some gridlock in the Non-Proliferation Treaty conferences, just like there has been in US Congress. And for some of my classmates that are not as familiar with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I can very quickly summarize that it's essentially the cornerstone of the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. It was a treaty opened in 1970 and has most countries in the world signing on to it, with a few very important exceptions. And ultimately, countries that signed on that had nuclear weapons agreed not to transfer that technology to countries that didn't already have it. And countries that did not have nuclear weapons technologies agreed not to receive that technology. But they signed on to this with the understanding that nuclear weapon states, as we call them, would work towards complete and total nuclear disarmament, which obviously has not happened, and hence gridlock on a number of issues, including the WMD-free zone in the Middle East and disarmament, obviously. So if we can assume that brokers in a network help to establish connections, more collaboration and affiliation, we can assume that gridlock can be overcome through increased collaboration and connections on policy issues. And so I looked at working paper collaboration at non-proliferation treaty conferences. So the ties in my network are representative of having worked on a paper together. As I've worked here at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, I've worked on the Non-Aligned Movement Disarmament Database, which for those of you that are not as familiar with the movement, it is essentially a coalition that was founded in 1961 among a group of 25 newly independent countries from colonial rule, and these countries wanted to support each other's development. They wanted to support each other's rights to self-determination, and they wanted to do so free of influence from, or free of alliance with global powers, including global nuclear powers. And so over the years, the network has grown to it's grown to 120 members with 17 observer countries, and nuclear disarmament has been one of its major issues that it advocates for, and it's very vocal at non-proliferation treaty conferences. writes a lot of working papers. So I wanted to look at the non-aligned movement, and particularly the observers in the movement, which are countries that typically affiliate with or even sometimes successfully champion the issues that are important to the non-aligned movement, but want to maintain some sort of degree of independence. And they can include the countries, as I've given here, some countries that have pretty advanced nuclear technological industries. Observers even include China, which has nuclear weapons. And so these countries, to me, represent delegations that are affiliating with the movement, which is largely made up of non-nuclear weapon states, but maintain a degree of independence and associate with nuclear weapon states on a number of issues. So to me, this could be the perfect example of potential brokers in the network. And I'll explain more about brokerage potential later. But for now, the structure of my presentation will first kind of go through my methodology that I used, including 3 measurements that I used to look at brokerage potential. Then I'll show you the network maps and the results, and then we'll give some analysis and some kind of conclusion. There may be some interesting results that you would not expect if you have been studying this sphere for some time, and I will do my best to explain those sort of unexpected results as best I can in the context of the methodology. So just to start off here with the concept of network analysis, how many people in the room have taken a network analysis course or are reasonably familiar with the methodology? Okay, so I will do my best to explain at a more granular level some of these methodologies. Ultimately, network analysis looks at relationships between individual actors through the use of statistics and math. It sort of quantifies these relationships. And it's a different way to look at relationships that do not have some of the more subjective factors that we think of when we think of how individuals invest in relationships. So what we call nodes, but which I will largely be calling actors, or entities that can be really any sort of catalyzing entity. It could be a person, it could be a company, an organization, it could even be a computer, anything that can be seen as sending or receiving information or resources. And the edges, the lines or the connections between them, which I will largely call ties or connections, represents some sort of information, resources. It could represent any other type of interaction where there's some sort of exchange or potential for exchange. And something important to remember about network analysis is that it assumes efficiency when running these calculations. And in real life, things are a little messier, and I'll explain further on what I mean by that. For example, in the first function that I used, Betweenness Centrality, this is a measure that calculates the number of times that a particular actor lies on the shortest path between any 2 other given actors in the network. And it assumes that the actor that lays on that shortest path has a certain amount of power in making that connection happen and controlling what kind of information or resources are sent and received between those actors. And again, when I mean efficiency, I'll give sort of a real life example. If you at this school do not know a student that you would like to get to know, you are not going to ask someone who knows nothing about them. You are going to ask someone who you know knows them or is closer to them than you are in order to make that introduction. That is what I mean by efficiency. In real life, it's not always like this, but I'll get into that when we look at some of the results. So Eigenvector Centrality measures indirect influence, and what I mean by this is the ability to influence a actor that has a lot of connections. So what this measurement takes into account is not only the number of connections that a node has, but it weighs it against the number of connections that node's immediate connections have. And so an example of this in real life would be a CEO of a company, which is the face, outward face of the organization, has a lot of meetings, might make a lot of connections in order to promote the work of the organization. But while the CEO will have high influence through a number of connections, the CEO's right-hand person or deputy, which might actually run the day-to-day operations of the company, will be seen as having high eigenvector centrality or high indirect influence in the network, because they are the right-hand person of the connection of the person that has the most connections. So in this particular example, node 4 would have the highest eigenvector centrality, because not only does it have the most connections, but its connections have more connections than others. Node 5 would have the second highest level of eigenvector centrality, because even though it has fewer connections than 4, it has a very high quality of connections, we could say. It has higher quality connections than nodes 1, 2, and 3, which have a lower eigenvector score than 4. So hopefully that helps, but I'll explain it more in context when we get to the results. The third function and the final function I'll be talking about today is brokerage roles, which measures the type of position or the type of role that a node will play in a relationship between 3 actors, which we can call a triad. So there's 5 different kinds of brokerage functions that this actor could play. A coordinator being a broker that works between 2 members of its own group. For example, in my analysis, I defined a group as the non-aligned movement, I defined another group as countries not part of the non-aligned movement, and I defined observers as another group. So a coordinator would, for example, be someone that organizes or brokers information flow between 2 nodes within its own group. A gatekeeper would broker information from outside its group within its own group, and a representative would broker information from its own group outside to another group. And an itinerant broker or consultant would broker information between 2 actors, both of which are not part of its own group. And same with a liaison, except in the case of a liaison, there are 3 different parties involved. So these are just different ways to quantify the type of function that an actor will play, and it sums it up in a score. So in terms of my methodology, I looked at working paper co-authorship. And what I mean by this is that in the network, if countries co-authored a paper with one another, all of those countries would have a tie within the network, would have a line between them. So for example, Australia in this case would have a tie with each and every one of the actors that it also co-authored a paper with. Same goes for Canada and down the line. So it creates a subgroup in a network that has a lot of communication or a lot of flow of information between them. And I wanted to explain my selection for criteria of working papers because it'll impact the way that the network looks. First of all, in terms of access and influence, working papers, despite that they're not the only activity, the only political activity that these countries and delegations will do at these conferences. There's informal and formal meetings, there's side events, there's established relationships that these countries have outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference. There's a whole spectrum of activities that a delegation can undergo in order to send and receive information and influence or leverage its contacts. But working papers was, for one, a type of data that is consistent. It's a complete record, and I could easily find it and load it into my program to do this analysis. If I were to look at who had informal meetings with one another at these conferences, that is just not data that I have access to. This is the kind of data that I wanted to work with because it was consistent, complete, and it's systematic, and I can look at it over time. Working paper co-authorship represents, despite that's not the only kind of political activity, an above average amount of influence, access to these other delegations, and the ability to communicate or collaborate on policy issues, and the potential to leverage one another from inside or outside their own subgroups to work on policy issues together. And this is essential when we think about brokerage. So it was a source of data to use. So the network that I looked at was actually the 2015 NPT Review Conference. I also looked at 2 other preparatory committees in 2017, 2018, but just for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to look at the 2015 network with you today. It was also the most complete network of all of them. By that I mean it had the most number of collaborators, collaborative working papers compared to the other 2. It had 19 collaborative working papers, 98 delegations working together collaboratively on working papers, and over 1,500 connections. In addition to why I selected working papers, I wanted to explain the working papers I included. I included any working paper that had more than 1 delegation on it, but there are 2 very important exceptions that have to do with the scope of what I wanted to look at. I didn't include European Union working papers, and I didn't include non-aligned movement working papers, which might seem unusual since I want to look at the role of the non-aligned movement in this network. But the reason is that, based on the way that network analysis works, if I were to put the entire representation of non-aligned movement in this network, which is 120 countries, it would give undue influence and representation to a lot of those countries that are not actually active at this conference and are not actually active on these issues. So it would have skewed the data in favor of influence, relevance, and importance to a lot of non-aligned movement members that in reality are not as active in these forums. And as far as the European Union papers, I found that actually European Union members in their individual capacity submit working papers collaboratively with one another. And so if I were to include European Union working papers, it would have a large amount of redundancy and it would create a lot of noise in the data and again skew it towards results that were not important to what I wanted to look at. I wanted to look at influence and brokerage between members that are from different regions, different parts of the network, but I didn't want to look at brokerage from within and without the non-aligned movement. We know that observers and non-aligned movement members that are collaborating with other countries would have some sort of influence on non-aligned movement members that are not collaborating.
Tracy, can I just ask a question? I mean, you may have covered this in your previously, but you're not excluding other regional political groupings. So
correct.
NPDI, NAT, Vienna Group.
Correct.
So why do you exclude the EU when NPDI also has members who issue papers and I'm just trying to think the logic of excluding 2 bodies. The non-aligned movement makes a little bit more sense because of the size, but I'm not as persuaded why the EU and not some of these other groupings.
Right, so members of the European Union often submit working papers with one another in different capacities. For example, the Zanger Committee has a lot of European Union members, and so I actually ran some statistics when including European Union working papers to see kind of what the results would find. And essentially, it just gave more weighted value to the connections between European Union members than it did before, but the overall results of the findings were not that different, and it created a lot of noise, a lot of connections that made it difficult to visually analyze the data.
Did you try to do that same kind of control for some of the other groupings?
No, because a lot of the other groupings don't duplicatively write working papers with one another as part of separate coalitions. If that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, we could talk more about it in the Q&A or at a later time. Okay, so this is the network map for the 2015 review conference when looking at Betweenness Centrality. And again, Betweenness Centrality is the measurement for how often an actor lies on the shortest path between others in the network. It assumes a certain influence and control over information exchange. And what we can say about the countries that are highlighted in this visualization is that they're often representative of a particular regional group or coalition, but are often the only 1 or 2 actors that also collaborate on other working papers with other coalitions. And so a lot of these parts of the network communicate a lot with one another, but they do not often communicate across groupings. The nodes highlighted for size are the ones that have higher scores than others. So if you see a country label, which might be hard to see based on the size that I could make it, if you see a country label but you don't see a node, it's because the score that particularly country got was so much lower than the ones that you actually can see. It's scaled for size based on score. And some of the findings for the top scores are sort of intuitive. We see a lot of members of the New Agenda Coalition in these results, which was founded on the premise of trying to build bridges between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states at these conferences. So that makes a lot of sense, but we might actually also see countries that don't make a lot of sense when we think of brokerage. For example, Egypt is seen and largely has been seen as a delegation that will block consensus at these conferences if it does not see progress in the areas that it deems important. And so they might not be seen as a broker for positive results, but actually the fact that Egypt can wield that amount of influence and could stall or block consensus for its own reasons actually does represent brokerage that it has for its own means. So just because we don't necessarily see some of these countries as traditional brokers doesn't mean that they don't hold a lot of influence in the network and exchange of information or resources. So I just wanted to point that out. We do see some observers, which would kind of match my hypothesis that non-aligned movement observers hold a position of brokerage in the network, particularly some of the countries I mentioned before that have advanced nuclear industries or are large regional economies such as Argentina, Mexico. What I thought was interesting is that repeatedly over these results, which I'll point out again, was that there were a few NATO countries that showed up repeatedly. And so while I normally would just label countries as part of NAM, not part of NAM, and observers, I actually labeled countries that are part of NATO, which are by default not part of the non-aligned movement because they have a military alliance with nuclear weapon states and they cannot be part of non-aligned movement. So I just thought that was particularly interesting because I wouldn't necessarily think of those countries as brokers, but they show up repeatedly in those measurements. Eigenvector centrality, which again is the measure of indirect influence in a network. So nodes are highlighted for size based on their eigenvector score, meaning the ones that are larger have more indirect influence in the network because their connections have more connections. And what we see through this visualization is that a lot of the countries which are not part of the non-aligned movement, which are highlighted in blue, have the highest level of indirect influence in the network. And if I didn't say it before, pink, or that kind of salmon color, is representative of observers of the non-aligned movement, and yellow is representative of non-aligned movement members. And so what this shows is that a lot of communication is happening between countries that are not members of non-aligned movement. There's a lot of collaboration, there's a lot of exchange of resources and information, but members of the non-aligned movement, largely represented on here as regional members of the Arab group or members of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which is officially the first sort of nuclear weapons free zone. Those countries do not often have as much exchange of information or resources or collaboration with other countries. There's just a few sort of connections or representatives from within their group out. And so I thought that was interesting that non-aligned movement countries are largely excluded when we look at this. Some interesting results that might not be intuitive is when you look at this, we see again some countries that are part of the New Agenda Coalition, like Ireland and Austria, but we also see countries that might not make a lot of sense, like Belarus. You wouldn't normally think of Belarus as having high brokerage potential. Why are they even on here? Well, for one, all of the countries that are part of the Zanger Committee all had the same brokerage score, which was 0.93 in this context. And so there was maybe there was a lot more than I could actually include on this slide, but I just wanted to include some unusual ones. Belarus, China, France, US, all part of the Zanger Committee, which largely looks at harmonizing the interpretation of how to apply safeguards on fissionable materials and nuclear technologies involved with those. Again, some unusual results, but based on the methodology and how it's put together, all of the Zanger Committee representatives are kind of seen as having a lot of influence in communication.
Can you just hold for a second?
Sure.
So what I find peculiar here is that, well, Belarus is the outlier, which makes no sense to me from a practical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're using the Zanger Committee as the explanation, why isn't Switzerland on there? Because the Zanger, Klaus Zanger was Swiss, if I'm not mistaken.
Although I don't have the stats in front of me, they're likely on the list, but I just couldn't include all of them on the screen.
Okay.
So countries with a score of 0.93 this year, they're all part of the Zanger Committee, but I just included a little ellipses here to show that there's actually more in there.
But methodological, do you mind if I just
No, please.
So, because anybody who attends these meetings would probably accept, most of the country, just intuitively would say, okay, if I understand the Eigenvector Centrality notion, I can kind of buy into much of what you're saying. But you have to ask yourself, why Belarus? Why is membership in Zanger, in fact, so heavily weighted that it determines Eigenvector centrality, when in fact it may be useful if you're talking about some aspects of export controls, but it's not going to be very helpful if you're talking, it's kind of an issue area thing. So if you talk, another way would be to think about disaggregating this, you're using RevCons to main committees. Because I think I'm uncomfortable with attaching so much influence to membership in a single body such as Zanger. It seems to me that it is overweighted, and perhaps if you were to disaggregate this into main committees 1, 2, and 3, you might actually achieve more explanatory power that is intuitive, or has an intuitive sense to it. So you could check that, I suspect. You obviously could check it. So I don't know, that's my take, I don't know.
Yeah, I can definitely look into that. I'll try to explain a little better what I meant by a lot of Zanger Committee countries being shown on here. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the European Union countries, they write many working papers with one another. And so in writing lots of working papers with one another, even if it doesn't include a complete membership of the European Union or a complete overlap with the Zanger Committee, what I noticed is that countries that are not part of the European Union, or not part of Europe, but are part of the Zanger Committee, seem to have higher brokerage than I would have suspected.
But I don't doubt that. But what I'm suggesting is that if you add as an additional explanatory variable issue area, then I think it will be intuitive. It will seem more logical to say that if you're talking about issues having to do with export control issues, then we find these countries perhaps playing a greater brokerage role. But if you're talking about disarmament issues, there's another factor at work, and you get kind of different centrality scores. Or if you turn to the non-proliferation or to the peaceful use dimension. So I think by disaggregating, you're likely to find different countries that have higher or lower brokerage scores, which may better help you explain to diplomats and others who are familiar with the process the value of this particular technique.
Sure. Yeah, and also I would like to figure out a way to include weighting for multiple inputs of data in one network. I believe there's a way to do it. It's just sort of above my sophistication at the moment, but I know that there's a way to load in multiple variables into the network as opposed to just looking at one factor like working paper authorship. So I think that could refine the results quite a bit.
Which is, I'm sorry to belabor the point here, but I think it'd be relatively easy for you to simply disaggregate your data according to the main committee. Because you're going to have, if you have the working papers, you're going to see the committees in which they were relevant. And so that would just be, it would be interesting, you know, if in main committee 2 and main committee 3, this is what prevails. But if you're talking about main committee 1 dealing with disarmament, you have an entirely different group.
I see.
Yeah,
so that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, you'd just be able to disaggregate findings that you already have.
That makes a lot of sense.
I mean,
Sure.
you know, it's not just the main committees. I would say, look at the main issues. I mean, export controls, as important as they are, I mean, they actually feature there's almost no feature in the NPT conferences. It's isolated to one main committee, and it's actually quite a controversial subject, particularly for the non-aligned. And so the brokerage for export control groups, or members of the export controls with the non-aligned is very minimal.
Okay.
So if you attach too much value to the Magnet Committee, I think there's a potential which skews your findings. So find a number of other topical areas spread out over the 3 main committees that would balance that.
In fact, another way to do, I'm trying to look at this in terms of ease of doing this. I mean, one, as I said, is the main committees. The others would just be the articles of the treaty.
Yeah.
And that would be very straightforward, and I think that would be another point to do the fall.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely would like to add that to sort of additional research I can do with this to make it a more sort of dynamic set of results. Yeah.
Thank you. This is very fascinating. And my knee-jerk reaction when I saw this table was when I see UAE being given as much weight as it's given, and I'm like, really? And then it's sort of like, I understood everything you were explaining, and then when I see that, I'm like, oh, let's go back to the explanation of what this is showing exactly, because I feel that a lot of those countries that you have with the connections to UAE, there is other countries that influence their contributions to working papers or what they ascribe to more than the UAE in the field of nuclear non-proliferation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I should have mentioned earlier, is that, you know, the network assumes that there's equal participation and collaboration and work done on these working papers by all of the co-authors. And in reality, that's just not true. There can be a small group of collaborators that are really writing it and championing the causes, and then get support from other countries that simply just sort of sign on. So yeah, you know, if I had some sort of data that could show activity or effort to that end, it would be much more accurate. UAE, in maybe not on this chart, but in one of the previous ones. Yeah, so UAE was one of the only 2 members of the Arab group that worked on other papers with other groups, and they were co-authors on multiple papers. And so even if UAE is not seen as a particularly active or influential delegation at these conferences, what it does show is that they are consulted or you know, spoken with on multiple issues. And so if members of the Arab group were to want to do some sort of outreach to delegations that they normally don't work with, at least UAE would know some of those other delegations, even if they're not doing as much of the influencing as some of the other members of various papers. The high score for them just shows that they work on so many other papers with other coalitions that if members of the Arab group wanted to reach out to, let's say, Sweden on a policy issue and wanted to have an introduction made, UAE would be the most likely delegation to do that. And so in thinking about brokerage potential, it definitely looks at potential, not necessarily what's actually represented in real life, but it could represent a sort of underutilized potential. So maybe UAE should be used more as a facilitator or a connector with other delegations, and maybe that would suit the network better for collaborative work. So yeah, definitely, that's one of the things to take in consideration with the methodology is that type of weighting or kind of real life comparison of what's happening.
Where's Indonesia on this list? Because
Yeah.
they tend to be thought of as, they chair the NAM disarmament working group, but they are seen by most states as kind of honest brokers, and from a practical standpoint, they're the ones that, the P5 like to talk to, most of the groups like to interact with them. And it may be a function of the working paper authorship, but that's, in your narrative, it may be worthwhile to note, one of the shortcomings of relying exclusively on working papers is that it discounts a player that many would regard as a key broker, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And although I don't have the statistics up at the moment, Indonesia I don't recall them factoring in very strongly on these scores. If they did, I would have to think of what working papers they co-authored with other countries in an individual capacity. They usually, from what I recall, would be sort of leading or presenting papers for non-line movement,
Right.
but which are not represented here. Yeah.
Well, I think that's the one problem. If you don't recognize the papers by the non-aligned movement, which essentially Indonesia is the driving force of it, then you're not going to see it.
By the same token, if I were to include them, Indonesia would have the same score and weighting as many other countries that are not active at all. And so if I'm approaching it as someone that does not know a lot about the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conferences, I might think that a lot of different countries are very important to the conference that actually are not active. And so it would weight them the same.
But I think that, I agree, I think methodologically what you just said is the right response, but I think somewhere in your paper, you have to recognize the shortcomings, if you will, of this approach. And one is to discount some major players who may have leadership roles in regional political groupings, who by virtue of those roles don't participate in as many diverse working papers, but in fact may play a brokerage role nonetheless, Indonesia being a case
A strong case for that. Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Yep.
Yeah, and I don't want to cut you off in case you got more slides coming up.
No,
too.
please. I just have one more of these network maps, so it's as good of a time as any.
Sure, of course. I was just going to ask if, because you have also been upfront of the some of the limitations of it just being working paper that you're looking at, and how it does miss out on some of the interpersonal relationships. If you do turn this into a larger paper, do you have any maybe plans to interview some of, maybe the CNS, some of the big players that have been to these conferences, like maybe that run the data by them, like they might be able to add some of their interpersonal take on, like, well, you might be like missing this person and stuff like that, like, and I think that might be kind of cool to add that qualitative aspect to this quantitative.
Yeah, absolutely.
analysis.
And I've actually talked with Mr. Dupree's about how I could build a survey and sort of have this survey answered by a number of experts that are more knowledgeable about these issues, that actually attend these conferences or have studied this for a long time, and to see how it compares with their knowledge of who are actually very influential brokers. And so that could be definitely one way to sort of close the gap and provide a more robust analysis for sure.
Yeah, but also I like what you're saying too, just about it being brokerage potential too, because that kind of rings true with me as well. That like it might not be that like these are the biggest players, especially because it's just working papers, but that this is also like a potential maybe that's being untapped. That it might be revealing a potential here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
This may be in your paper, but I'd be interested to see, like, say, a couple examples of papers that were made by these brokers, and like
Sure.
what kind of papers are they collaborating on? I'd be interested to know like what brings
Sure.
them in terms of topic and subject matter.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could somewhere, I don't have it in my paper, but I actually should probably provide some sort of a summary or a chart on the main themes of issues that these delegations work on together. That's a really good idea. Just so that going into the analysis, readers would have an understanding of why the map looks like it does. Because, you know, for example, I know from having read the working papers that this group down here that is amongst itself very connected, but not connected with other parts of the network except through these members, that this is the Treaty of Tlatelolco and the kind of group of states that signed on to that. And I know that the Arab group has submitted multiple papers and they're on this side of the network. So yeah, absolutely, that would definitely, I'm gonna write some of these notes down, by the way. But,
We have notes, so one.
We're filming it.
oh, filming it, great, okay.
Is that right?
Sorry,
That's
question,
okay.
and let's move on.
Okay, I was going to ask, you know, for example, like when we look at Argentina, so basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is, the way these working papers work is that sometimes, like the United States can come to Zimbabwe and say, we're doing a paper on the DPRK and their firing of missiles. Would you like to sign on? And all I have to do is ask my ambassador, and if my ambassador says yes, then I don't even have to read this paper, I don't have to contribute to the paper, but Zimbabwe will be on that list. So I guess, like, once again, I'm just concerned that looking at whose name was signed on to a working paper, I love the idea of the network analysis and brokerage potential, but I'm not as married to the working paper sign-off thing because,
Yeah, absolutely, and I mean,
I don't know how you could beat that.
But one way you could do this, this is more like a book than an article, is if you took a particular case. So it doesn't really even matter what the case is. It could be, you know, how do you address the issue of the NSG exemption for India? Just one of my favorite examples here. Lots of commentary, lots of parties talking about it, maybe even papers that have been written, or you could have one dealing with nuclear security, or you could have one dealing with security assurances, or whatever the topic. Take do one case study and compare. Of course, I mean, you can skew this by the case that you pick. You can do this in advance, but it would illustrate. You could kind of walk through the process by which parties collaborated in promoting a particular issue by the working paper, and then also look at what you see quantitatively. So it would be a way to get Nose's notion. This is the way it actually happened. This is what we capture when we do network analysis. And so it would help the reader better understand the process. And you could kind of point out, you know, some of the shortcomings, but you can also make the case that let's say we're looking at the issue of HU minimization. You might discover that Kyrgyzstan, which doesn't appear anywhere on this,
it's not that they're not
actually was,
anywhere, I
and
just don't
Norway
have room
were
to-
more central than you might have guessed. So,
Right.
I mean, just to you provide some background that would be useful.
right, okay.
And there's another element, I mean, Nonce's point is a good one about, you know, that you sign on to a paper, but you know, you can have access to the records of these meetings. I mean, there are written records, and very often states would lend their verbal support to a paper, but they do not, maybe they don't have the authority to physically put their name on the paper, or, you know, for a variety of reasons they don't want to be associated in writing with the paper. But they would take the floor and strongly support the paper, and often actually speak to the paper during the conference as it progresses. So it might be, you know, it would require quite a bit of additional research and mining through the PVs, but that could be a useful exercise too.
Absolutely, and something that I wanted to do in further research was looking at voting behavior, for example, in the first committee, but this type of data that you're speaking about would lend itself well to this analysis as opposed to looking at a different sort of forum. I'm gonna call in Mary real quick and then we'll sort of move on, I guess.
You only have one more slide, is what you said?
No, I just have one more network map.
Okay. This is, I'm not sure if you're going to touch on this in your paper, but I'd be interested in hearing about sort of your opinions or your future outlook on the utility of this brokerage potential and the data that you've garnered for other multilateral non-proliferation regimes.
Okay.
Because I'm the players and the roles that you have analyzed in terms of working papers and other things too with NPT, I think it would be really interesting to look at how your data could possibly be used to further research or analyze, used as a lens for other multilateral approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be really interesting to work at, and then see if there's any sort of commonalities in different ways too. That might add like a level of verification in some way on whether these results actually are consistent across issues and forums. Yeah, absolutely. I'll move on just to the last network slide, looking at brokerage roles. No, that's Eigenvector. Let's see. Brokerage roles. And so again, brokerage roles looks at the role that an individual country plays in the relationship between three different actors. And so what kind of facilitation role does it play? I just gave the scores for sort of the total of all of the roles. I didn't, give you slides with each of the 5 different roles that they could play. But again, we repeatedly see countries from the New Agenda Coalition, which sort of intuitively makes sense as bridge builders, Ireland, Mexico, and such. We also again see those key NATO countries that I mentioned. We see Germany, Poland, Netherlands, and so what this says to me is that for brokerage roles and betweenness centralities, there's definitely consistency. And those two measures are known to be brokerage measures, whereas eigenvector centrality, even though you can argue that it represents access or brokerage, it's not traditionally thought of as a brokerage measure, it's thought of as an influence measure. So that might be why there's consistency between the first and the third. But again, we see some observers of the non-aligned movement show up, Mexico, Argentina, Kazakhstan. Argentina and Mexico show up repeatedly, and actually a lot of the results that I've shown you today are similar across the different years that I analyzed, 2017 and 2018 as well. With that, I will just sort of summarize and conclude. Against my hypothesis that non-aligned movement observers would have a position of brokerage potential within the network, there's definitely a few that did. Some that make sense that are either regional powers or part of the New Agenda Coalition, or have high-tech nuclear industries. I thought it was interesting that China and actually even Belarus showed up as having, relative to the rest of the network, high eigenvector centrality, which again is explained by the fact that even though they're not on many of the papers that the European Union countries write in their individual capacity, they are on that one Zenger Committee paper, which represents a certain amount of access that other countries don't have, particularly as Belarus is the only member of the non-aligned movement from Europe, so that actually could say something about facilitation of introductions or collaborative work to one another. Other delegations I mentioned had repeatedly high brokerage potential across measures and across different years within the networks. Some key non-aligned movement members are Egypt, UAE, Chile, and South Africa. Again, some of these make intuitive sense, like South Africa having shown considerable leadership at non-proliferation treaty review conferences. Others might not make sense, like Egypt or even UAE, as we talked about a little bit. But again, I just want to emphasize that this maps potential through access and collaboration on papers. It's not a comprehensive spectrum of all the activities at these conferences. A few NATO members as well. and a few key European non-NATO countries, some of which are part of the new Agenda Coalition, or previously were. Yeah, so in summary, just based on the measures that I used, it looked like, in terms of a network of communication and collaboration, some key non-aligned movement members and observers were brokers within the network. When looking at Betweenness Centrality and Brokerage Potential, they kind of were on the path between a lot of different regional groups or groups that write working papers on particular issues. But when looking at things like Eigenvector Centrality, they were largely excluded, which says that there's a lot of communication, collaboration happening with European Union members on a number of issues that non-aligned movement members are just excluded from. And so that says something about the ability for observers to broker relationships in that situation. It would not work as well. So future research, as I mentioned, I will definitely take into consideration all of your comments, because this will be really helpful for me developing sort of a more robust methodology and just sort of considering different factors in what constitutes as brokerage at these different forums. I also would like to look at voting behavior in the first committee of the United Nations, similar to the first example I gave of the US House of Representatives. Having ties between one another based on voting behavior, I think that would be very interesting to do, as Mary mentioned, in other forums like First Committee. And I'd also like to look at the issue of transitivity, which is the concept that two unconnected actors are more likely to meet or make a future connection if they have a specific type of broker involved. So I want to, as sort of the next natural step in this research, look at brokerage potential and then sort of look at the likelihood for connections to be made based on the types of actors in the network and the structure of the network. And as far as noteworthy papers, if you're interested in this subject, there's some really interesting research done on it. The first of these being that first example of the US House of Representatives, the second one talking a lot about transitivity in a network and the structure of the network and how that actually determines future connections. And the third one you might be particularly interested in. It is accepted and will be coming out at an unknown time in the International Studies Review, and it just happens to be a paper on pretty much the same subject that I've been doing research on. I was connected with a scholar recently that was working on the same topic. I got to read through the paper, which was exciting, and to look at the different results that this person got. So watch for that if you're interested in this. It uses a different methodology and has some interesting results as well. So thanks for your attention, and I'll take any additional questions or feedback and can go back to any of these network maps if you want to have a better look. And obviously ask me about the data if you're more curious about who did not show up in these top 10 or 15 spots. It's just all the room that I had. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So, we have some time. I thought this was a very well prepared presentation. Thank you so much, and congratulations. I think it's a really interesting subject. I mean, as a NPT dinosaur, I find this enlightening to look at it from a different perspective. What I picked up is the potential for brokerage,
Right.
which, I mean, you referred to the UAE, which to me, when I saw your paper the first time, it's a glaring sort of what? Never seen a UAE delegation at the NPT conference almost, but
Mr. Al-Kabi.
yeah. But there's a reverse. I mean, Dr. Potter mentioned, I think you referred to how the Arab group delegations could reach out, but it's actually the reverse would probably be more useful, to use the UAE as a broker instead of Egypt, to look at how you can reach out to individual Arab group states. So, anyway, with that, I will open the floor.
Yeah, any additional questions? I wanted just to make sure to get through the last through slides, but please.
Tracy, let me second John's high appraisal of your presentation. I mean, it was really very professional, and I think were you to give this at a meeting, say at the International Studies Association or wherever it might be. It was as good as any presentation that one would expect to see from, faculty members, PhD students, and the like. So I think it really has great merit. The other virtue of delivering in that setting is those folks will have no idea about what the NPT process is, and so they'll probably focus more on the network analysis. But that leads me to my second point. I think there is potential in your research for a publication in a major peer-reviewed journal, because it combines important methodology with a topic about which you're also very familiar. And so I would think about a multi-phased kind of approach to your research and publications. You can have a target, and even for something as rarefied as the American Political Science Review, or I would actually go for international organizations. So that would be the place that I would focus on. But it's not easy to get a piece accepted there, no matter who you may be. But I think this has the potential, so I would think about that. By the same token, I think you could generate, you're not looking for tenure, you have the potential in this research to get a whole slew of publications. You could pick a journal that is going to be more methodologically oriented, and then you can emphasize more the methodology and its applicability to policy issues. By the same token, you can take a journal that is more interested in the policy dimension and perhaps illustrate how some non-obvious potential brokers may be identified using this methodology. So I think you need to be careful not to take all of our suggestions to heart, because otherwise you'll become a dinosaur before you get this, this published. So you should have in mind, this goal, and I think you can refine it a piece that is manageable within, let's say, the next 6 months or something like that, which you can pedal to a number of very respectable places, which nonetheless will not capture all of the things that we're suggesting. At the same time, you have a future kind of research agenda, and so you could get a number of publications, maybe shooting for something very special. By the same token, what I really encourage you to think about, though, is presenting at a major professional gathering, whether it is the International Studies Association, the American Political Science Association, or other organizations, because I think you have the poise and you're articulate, and you can kind of speak to issues which are complex. And that's not something that even some very senior scholars are able to do. And I think actually, having read your paper and then listened to your presentation, I think it's much clearer from your presentation than the paper. So having the opportunity to kind of share this would be good. And the other virtue of that is that you may actually find people who are editors or on the editorial boards of some of these journals in the audience. And so they may seek you out. I mean, if they see, you're a graduate student, they may be somewhat less inclined to treat it. No, I mean, it's just the way it is. I mean, they try to, these are supposed to be masked, and maybe you could do so. But if there's somebody who actually sees the presentation, I mean, I would come away very, very intrigued, even if I didn't know you. So I just think it has, great potential. It's really interesting. I think there are a lot of things that you could do to make it stronger, but I just wanted to make sure you came away knowing that it's really an impressive piece of research.
Well, it was definitely really complex figuring out how to explain these concepts and explain the findings in a way that made sense and was relevant despite the shortcomings of the methodology. And I really appreciate all of the opportunity to hear what could be done with it in other iterations of research in order to highlight both the shortcomings and the opportunities in this kind of research, and highlight that it has the potential to identify delegations that normally aren't thought of as having some sort of access or brokerage potential. So I really appreciate that, and I definitely look forward to further iterations and working to try to get some surveys out and all that. So I'll be working with you to make sure.
With that in mind, I mean, also with your intention of looking at first committee voting patterns, which, you know, those are far more vetted than NPT papers. I mean, there's before you, as a delegation, press that button and your name appears on the board, you better have backing of your capital to do so, for most cases. So, I mean, the earlier comment also about expanding it to the broader nuclear non-proliferation regime may actually lead you to findings that could suggest potential brokers in a broader sense outside the NPT. The NPT can be very procedural sometimes and so on. So, but looking at the broader sense of, you know, who is a broker to deal with the issue of the Middle East, or, you know, who's a broker that would facilitate the issue of disarmament. We have a ban treaty on the one side and we have opponents on the other side. That you'll probably also see clearer in first committee resolutions, not only on the voting pattern but also the sponsorship of resolutions. Because, you know, you can vote for a resolution, but if you're a co-sponsor of a resolution, your brokerage potential becomes so much more powerful.
There also is a separate literature on issue areas.
Yeah.
I mean, in the political science and IR literature, which may also, I mean, it can go on, you know, John's point, some of the other earlier discussions about who may be brokers on certain issues. I may have or have brokerage potential on certain issues, but not on others.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to say to Tracy, I was so impressed by this presentation. It is probably better than 90% of the presentations I actually attended at the Lyon.
That is not necessarily a compliment.
And I say this because your ability to explain something that I've literally never heard of before, network analysis. I mean, I knew what the words meant individually, but I did not know what the subject matter was about. You explained that very well. You didn't lose me with the 1, 2, 3, 4s, which is usually where I get lost with math and numbers. And then your ability to field the questions, the different questions, and you had people sort of derailing your stream of thought, but you were able to respond to the question. You were able to respond to the question and yet get back to your point. And I think you just handled that with so much aplomb and grace. And I hope that by the time I leave this institution, I'll be able to give a presentation to her. And that's basically all I wanted to say. Oh, and I just wanted to ask as well, in terms of your analysis, have you, I think something else you could look at for further research would be to look at who has authored those working papers, if you can get that information. Because it might reveal a different data set in terms of who has the brokerage potential.
As in who was the main champion that went around to get other people on it.
And who wrote it.
Yeah.
Just because you'll have a paper with like 12 countries, but maybe it was written by New Zealand.
I see. I see.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. That makes a lot of sense.
And what you can do, in some instances at least, you know, at first committee, is you can watch the different iterations of the same paper. So you can see the group that was initially engaged, you know, version 2, other countries add their names. So you can actually, I'm not sure how accessible early editions are, but in principle you could actually track the evolution of a paper or a resolution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as far as working papers, I know that there's quite a record over time on reaching critical will. I don't know how far back it goes, but I imagine it goes back pretty far. Yeah, so I could look at that. Yeah. Well, thank you for your flattering
Any other
compliments.
comments?
I really appreciate that.
Suggestions?
Well, and all of your feedback is so helpful for me, you know, especially those of you who have been to these conferences and have the working experience to know how the process actually works to get kind of sponsorship and co-authorship and actually what the most influential interactions really are. And I think that's going to be key in additional analysis is getting all of your advice on how to measure and get data on that type of activity and who I can reach out to get that kind of information. That's going to be really helpful.
And if you send me a short note, I'll forward this to the ambassador of Belarus. I'm sure he'll make a statement mentioning you in the general debate.
Okay. Well, with that, Tracy, thank you very much. You certainly set the bar very high for quality of presentations and research. So good luck with the rest of your research.
Thank you. Yeah,
forward to
we'll
the
definitely
end
be
result.
talking more. So
Okay.